Hello and welcome to the 27th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts dozens of free and low-cost readings, craft classes, panel discussions, and many more exciting literary events. This year's headlining authors are Maggie Smith, Lee Young Lee, and Dinez Smith. We're thrilled to be hosting in-person events featuring those headliners alongside over 60 talented writers from our region and beyond. The festival takes place this Thursday through Sunday, April 10th through the 13th, in many venues across downtown Spokane, Cheney, and even Coeur d'Alene. And we're excited to be presenting 8 virtual events here on YouTube this year. You can find our full schedule along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Draper, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Hello and welcome to Aftermaths, Poets on Nationhood, Fatherhood, and Selfhood. Conversations around masculinity rarely reflect the complex contours of maleness, the intersecting identities of nation, race, culture, and language of origin. In today's discussion, we'll hear from 3 writers who use poetry to push back against limited notions of masculinity, Americanness, and the very borders of nation and self. These poets have vastly different backgrounds from one another and will use their experiences of fatherhood, addiction, and self-connection to explore with us the complications and sharp edges of masculinity's limits. Before we jump into today's discussion, let's start with introductions. I'll begin with the moderator of today's event, Jed Bloor. Jed is a writer, poet, and MFA candidate at Eastern Washington University. Originally from Melbourne, Australia, Jed has been fortunate to also call Washington State, Seattle, and now Spokane home. Previous iterations of Jed include global health academic, science to policy translation expert, and psychotherapist. Thanks for being with us today, Jed. Now I'll pass it back over to Kate to introduce our first reader.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie, and thanks, Jed, for being here with us today. So our first poet reading today is Ayakunle Falomo. Ayakunle is Nigerian, American, and the author of multiple collections of poetry, most recent of which are Autobiomythography of and African Americant. A recipient of fellowships from Vermont Studio Center, MacDowell, and the University of Michigan's Helen Zell Writers Program, where he obtained his MFA in creative writing, poetry. His work has been anthologized and widely published. Welcome, Ayakunle.
Thank you so much. And it is a great pleasure to be here with Matt and Andres. I look forward to hearing you both read. And Jed, thank you for being here as well, Mackenzie and Kate. It's been really nice to see, like, since the past few months, like, messages back and forth, not knowing whether this was actually going to be a real thing and then counting the days until it is actually like here. So very, very excited to be here. I'll read from the 2 most recent collections. I'll start with a poem that is titled Prayer, and then I'll read from the most recent collection. Prayer for Erica Garner and Brianna Taylor and Oluwatoyin Salau and the Chibok girls and what in this country, Lord, this country of soot, where breath is easily snuffed out of a body. Lord, what is this country? This country that is not my father's, Lord. What in this country can a father promise his daughter but smoke? Lord, my sister Ebony says no one turns over the earth when a black girl goes missing, Lord. When a black girl goes, she goes like smoke. And no one turns when a black girl goes, when she goes missing, Lord, she goes. And Lord, I've been and not been no one. Lord, I have no tools with which to turn the earth except my pen, which is a useless shovel. Lord, the bed I rest my body on is asphalt, Lord. And in my sleep I turn, and back in my mother's country, There is a chorus of mothers still singing to no one. Bring back our girls, goes the refrain of the song. Bring back our girls, they sing, bring back our girls, and I, being no one, join the chorus, and I sing, and sing, bring back our girls, with the wings on their backs intact. With words, I string them back to the backs their mothers backed them with. I sing them back into their mother's arms. I sing them wings. I sing them and sing them back. And Lord, I bring them. And the next poem is called Intro to Semantics. Who led it? My rudderless tongue at the helm of language. Though like a boat I'm building it, it does not yet exist, a language for this war-torn world. How can I language it for my daughter, who is soon to turn 3, old enough to grasp the basic rules of grammar, its tenses and plurality, but young enough to still be fascinated with the way words slip through the fingers like sand? Buckle me out, she says. So because, she says. What is it called like, she asks. Jump me in the air, she says. War. No. Genocide is not a word she knows just yet. And it is a holy thing. Her laughter this morning, tonight in Sudan, tonight in Gaza. A father will hear his daughter's voice for the last time. I am at the border of language, asking, where does a child's laughter go when it stops? When the walls that would otherwise echo her wails are turned to rubble? Let me languish in this, that I can't language life back into the many massacred. I worry meaning out of language, but in the language of the dead, what is the word for breath? Yet, alive in me is a long lost language of silt. What I want left of me for my offspring when I am gone is what the gentle spring leaves as legacy for the bank. I am a poet, which means I can tell the shape of every word on the tip of my tongue. I have known grief to be a square. Tonight it is a cone. I am a dog without a bite. I am a wounded dog that makes no sound. My mouth a witness stand. My teeth are witnesses. I confess that I too have been guilty of thinking war a metaphor for what it's not. I know it now. Not every language is a mother tongue. Speak to me, mothers who know too well the language of loss, who have no language but loss. What language has mothered you, and which has smothered your voice? My tongue was forked from birth, but in this murderous language I inherited, I find a way to address and redress the world. I find in it a bloodied dress. What else to do but wear it well, the laced frill of it, until I'm spent and worn out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ayakunle. Next, we have Andres Serpa. Andres is the author of 2 books of poetry, Bicycle in a Ransacked City, an Elegy, and The Vault, which was longlisted for a National Book Award and celebrated as one of the best poetry books of 2021 by the New York Times. A recipient of a MacDowell Fellowship, his writing has appeared in Plowshares, Poem a Day, The Kenyon Review, The Nation, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Please welcome Andres.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for that reading. I'll jump right in. My first poem is titled We Are the Transient Ones, which is a line that was found on Franz Wright's typewriter after he died. So it's some of his last notes. Too soon, I became the thing that hunted and slept alone, devoid of ritual, and the apartment fathers up light. Metaphor for the mind, but still a heart of winter. Speedball, goodbye. And why is it so hard to tell the truth about the past? What remains almost untouched? Our time in the orchard where we became the orchard, then laughed in a crevice of tree. I feel the whispers of owls so far north that no human will ever see them again. Memory is a dead animal lost in its grandeur. A wolf split and howling. A hawk as small as a leaf. Delphi. The horses starved, then came back as snow. Dementia, fire, rings in the trees swaddling frost. For a year, sparse meals and our child in mud. This morning, I worried about money, the life we've made and the future, how long it would take to dig out the car. I left my job for visions of horses. I'm never coming back was the lie. Debt, rent, a child, at the center of the world, our hands in a blizzard of touch. This is another poem. It's titled Late Work. It kind of comes from a series of poems of that title. A fear of the poem is a fear of the future, and I am afraid. In the dark heirloom of the earth, I was nourished, am nourished. I question God. The country's ugly gossamer weaves another dust. The horizon in starved horses. Everything all at once. As we walk, I hold the secret vein, my only child, an emerald in the heirloom of the earth. No, this is the last poem. It's titled The Mat. There was no applause when God entered the labyrinth, carrying a dead man as an example by his throat. There were birds and lathe work, but the people that tended its growth had gone home to their corner encampments to watch your children go gaunt, to be conquered, to be blindfolded by history and asked to lead the way. Hunger is a teacher, God said. It masters even time. For when hunger became, the forest became a cacophony of voices, and every hoof print and drift became us alert. In hunger, being alive was being alive for each and every cell. The labyrinth is a cell. North, and I kept running. Abuela died in the Bronx with a gold-plated cross on her neck. I ran through the woods with a gold-plated cross on my neck.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andres. Our final reader is Matthew Nino. Matthew is the author of the recently released collection, If Nothing, as well as House of Water, both from Alice James Books. His work has appeared in Gulf Coast, New England Review, Plowshares, and Poetry, and has been recognized with fellowships from the Poetry Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. He lives in Port Townsend, Washington with his wife and sons, where he works as a mental health counselor. Please welcome Matthew.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's such a treat to be here with two poets I really, really admire and to hear you read. I'll start off with a poem called Every Gift Carries a Cost. It is difficult to go back into the burning, into the bitter bowl. The knife my grandfather gave me, carving char and resin. Its plastic scales meant to approximate bone. My grandfather, now only ash and shards of bone in a bag, in a brown cardstock cylinder no bigger than my fist. I can't look at him as I use his knife, as I smudge the silver glint against the heated glass, aching for a chemical dose of what I think must, at the cellular level, approximate the bodily feeling of love. This next poem is called History. There is no way I can explain the past in a manner that doesn't somehow free the sparrow from the barn, but not before it crashes against the glass, over and over, falling to the bench. Stunned and on its back, I scooped the sparrow from the wood and carried it outside, while it slowly turned its head and nipped my fingers with its beak, a dun ghost weightless in my hands. I gave the bird to the crook of a willow, then stood back. Even that day, I had been thinking of killing myself. When the bird finally flew, I was offered no thanks, no revelation. Saving that small life from the trap of a building did not change me. At least not then, when I could see no other way to be. When it would have been impossible for me to imagine ever being the bird. This poem's called Multitudes. A hymn is what time does with the body. The singing isn't for us, but we can listen in. Out of the one we enter and splinter into the ego's eye and endure detached eras of solos and deem this right, the way of the world we inhabit. But listen, and I don't mean to the words, but what is under the words and beyond the sound. The world inhabits us, gives flesh to the idea of bone, makes a space inside the shape of a body which is to remain empty and therefore true. The world does not belong to us, even as we contain what makes the world. At 30, I had tattooed on my wrist Whitman's apology to himself, the one that speaks of contradictions. And for a couple years, the letters of the smallish font held out as crisp individuals I could pass my fingers over. Multitudes. A dream house of a body and one in which to dream without worry of being wrong. And so, like Whitman, I sang of it, but mostly with a sadness for years of being sorry for being. The body likes the song and relaxes into the listening if one is lucky. O failure, my greatest teacher, I bow before you even as you kick sand into my face. I'm to remain at your feet as the letters wash into themselves, as the words become unreadable, and only then, perhaps, briefly understood. The body goes. It was nothing personal. Now, close with one more poem that's called And Then, and it kind of reads right into the poem. So, and then I took off my shame like a dress made of light, like a dress made of the self-spun cocoon. I was not beautiful. It was not about beauty. Beneath my shame, the body was a raw, red thing, untrained in acceptance. But the air was delicate and cool as a mother blowing gently on a burn. I had lived so long in the fabric, I thought it my skin. I had forgotten how new anyone forgiven can become. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Now that we've heard readings from our poets, let's turn things over to Jed to kick off our conversation.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. Thank you, Kate. Thank you to these three wonderful writers. Thank you for the readings. If we were in person, I feel like we'd have the books behind us. So I just wanted to show each book before I launch into a question. So Akonle's books, we've got Matt's books here, and it was such a pleasure to spend the last 6, 7, 8 weeks since finding out about this event with each of your work. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate this opportunity to be in conversation with you and to open up this conversation. And I'm curious where you'd like to take this conversation as well. But to set this up, what I was thinking about, especially today, after hearing Jericho Brown talk about intimacy and love. So he said, I want to say intimacy by showing you intimacy. And I feel like I got that sense in each book of intimacy with you. I feel like I know something of the speakers in each of the poems, and perhaps by reflection, by extension of you all. And I so appreciate that. And I feel so connected in that regard. And Jericho Brown said, every poem is a love poem. And Kevin Young kind of pushed him on that, and he gave a bit more of an answer. So curious to if you have an answer to that for yourselves, if you agree, or if you feel like that comes through your work or is a central facet of your work. And finally, the kind of the jumping off point, I think I'm always curious to know why this particular art form, and when this particular art form became something that you felt like you wanted to pour your energy and pour your life into, and whether the answer to this question of why poetry or why written language has changed for you over time, and if so, in what ways has it changed? So I'll invite you to answer in the reading order, and then we can mix it up after that. Aikenley?
Yeah. Yeah, what a way to start. Wow, that is so expansive. Thank you, Jed. And it's also very beautiful to see all our books like together in that way that you just shared. So thank you also for that. Um, yeah, I love that we're starting with Kevin Young and Jericho Brown. Those are two writers that I admire a lot and whose work, quite frankly, have influenced mine as well. And I feel like my work would not be if, they were not writing. So I appreciate that. I actually just shared, I had a person reach out to me for a writing consultation. And so yesterday I typed up the feedback letter, and one of the recommendations I made was to check out Jericho Brown's The Tradition, that poem, the title poem in the collection. So, it's just like it's nice to be in that kind of like realm, unconsciously in a way. So, but to address the question of love and if every poem is a love poem, yeah, I mean, I do agree that it is, but don't take my word for it because I'm also the type of person who would say every poem is, insert something. Every poem is an elegy. Every poem is a prayer. Every poem is a letter. Every poem is an essay. I have done that before and split the room with that opinion. Uh, which ties into why poetry, I suppose. I feel like poetry for me wasn't necessarily like a choice. When I started writing, I've been writing since I was 6 or so, perhaps even younger than that. But 6 is kind of like the age that I can go as far back to. Uh, I started writing fiction, right? So short stories, imitations of stories that I was reading, stories that I was listening to from my parents, from, neighbors, from my grandparents, right? Just like imitating and writing my own versions of like things that I was like consuming as a child. And, over time that morphed into writing plays, for my church group, right? And every Sunday we would put together like a play, right? Uh, and then transition into like a love for like screenwriting. And just nothing really like ever happened with that. But enough of an interest for me to be looking up, film schools. Um, and more recently, like poetry, and I say more recently in the span of like maybe 12 years or so now, poetry has kind of been the new thing. Uh, and even though I've, sort of kind of abandoned the other genres, right, for the most part, uh, poetry has stayed. And I think the reason for that is because it allows me to be able to still reach for those interests that I have earlier on in other genres, right? Poetry is a space where I feel like I have the most freedom to be able to explore, right? My love for screenwriting, my love for fiction, right? My love for mythology, my love for philosophy, my love for theology, right? In a way that other genres like really did not, or, one might argue cannot, maybe to a certain degree. Uh, so yeah, poetry is the space where I can be able to like be the fullest version of myself, I would say. And that embrace, that gesture is an act of love, right? It's a way to kind of re-meet myself every day on the page, right? And accept myself as fully as I can, which also means I can accept the people around me, right? My relationships with the people that are closest to me, which also is a space for me to try and understand, where I come from, where I'm living right now, people who are strangers, right? And, ultimately that is an act of love. So yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Andres?
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that like to to continue that idea of like why poetry, why this art form in particular. I don't know when exactly it was, but I lost the plot somewhere along the way. And that's like not to say that my poems don't have narrative in them, but more so than narrative, what I think they have is a clarity of conflict, right? So I think that I'm setting up like this is the conflict that this speaker is going through, or this is the conflict that the world is sort of, oscillating around. And then poetry offers these moments of pause and offers an intensity of focus that I think in my own life I prioritize and am moved by, right? There are moments that, I'm sitting outside of Penn Station on these stone steps and I see something and it feels as though like the whole world has paused and kind of miraculous and mysterious in a lot of ways. And I think poetry allows me to tap into that visual sense, and like enter that mind, revisit that place, manipulate reality in such a way that it's like in the ecstatic mode. Um, so I think for me, poetry is there, and the stories get like kind of like lost in it, but it's helpful to know what's going on just a little bit sometimes. And then in terms of like the idea of like the intimacy and love poems, Um, when I think about intimacy, I think about detail inside of poetry and creating a sense of intimacy through detail. Right. I think that the authors that I love best, like Jed, you kind of like tapped into it. You feel like you know something about them, right? And obviously you do, right? Like you like engage with their art, this labor of love. But at the same time, I think it's so important to have that connection of like materializing the world kind of like together. They did it through writing it, and you're sort of reactivating it through reading it, which I find pretty powerful.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah. I love these responses. How we cross over and the places that we also differ. I guess I'll start with that love piece. Something that I think about, and I think more the way that I think that's true is when we complexify the notion of love. You know, I think when we think love poem at the surface, we often think romantic love, some kind of interest, you know, but I think that the practice of love, in all the ways that shows up is messy, it's, it often has like the dark parts in it. It's, the really rough stuff to keep showing up again and again, to love somebody or something when it doesn't love you back or when it's hard to love. I think poems do that for sure across the board. But I also love what you said, Aikunle, about, like same is true. It could be an elegy, it could be some other thing. And so I think those layers like love may encompass some of that when we look at it in that way. Um, my own path to poetry came late. I didn't start, as a kid. In fact, writing on the page for me was probably the most difficult thing aside from math. It was just like I really struggled with school. And so I didn't come to it until I was about 20. But I was a musician and started writing songs when I was really young. And I think though I find that experience very different for me, like the sounds, the rhythms, the textures of the actual like physical making of a sound and the way we receive it was something that was and continues to be strong for me. And so I think I found poetry, luckily through some great teachers at that age, and something lit up for me because there was this real invitation to break rules, right? Even as there's this idea of form as like part of our history. When I first read contemporary poems at that age, I was like, oh, I can do this too. All these expectations that had been laid out for me that felt so challenging, suddenly, I could push against them in a way. And I find freedom in that. I also find mystery and magic, like the spell-like quality of reaching towards an emotional truth rather than necessarily a logical truth, or kind of finding a different way in. And sometimes for me, the meaning is through the sound and the texture, and sometimes like that conveys its own logic that can happen in prose, can happen in other forms, but doesn't always happen. It's definitely not required. But I think in poems, it's almost always required in some way for it um, to really like hit us in that way, that emotional truth. All the different, styles of poems out there, they got to sound right. They got to have some certainty, some, that detail, some way of being. And sometimes yeah, it's through our ears and through our senses, but it's not necessarily through the logic or intellect.
Yeah, beautiful. As you were part of your answer, I think leads me into my next question, coming back to the themes of the event, but also the themes that are throughout your books, selfhood, fatherhood, and nationhood, and how we get handed down these rules or norms. We enter into the world and are kind of imposed. They have these norms imposed on us in many ways or taught to us. Um, in what ways do you feel that you uh, kind of receive that and then re-author that for yourself? And how has that how does that show up in your work? Or is that something you think about is reflected in your work? Anyone want to jump in on that? initial thought.
I
Yeah,
can
go.
jump in to say, yeah, I think you have to. Like, I don't know any other way to answer that other than like, yes, right? Like you just something you have to do. Um, uh, Definitely as a person, right? But also like as a writer, because it's if you're not doing that, then what are you? I'm very curious, like what are you doing, right? And I mean that like very genuinely, like I would like to know. If you're not, yeah, if you're not trying to troubleshoot, the things that you've received, right, for yourself. Uh, like, yeah, whether inherited, whether you've like received them or like rejected them, like if you're not dancing in that way, like I don't, yeah, I suppose I don't know what the point of poetry or art is in that regard if there is not that tension. It certainly plays out for me in I love play, right? Like I write about very serious things, but I would not be writing if I'm not invested in, as Matt said earlier, like in music, right? The texture of language. And I love what you said earlier too, Andres, about like the clarity of conflict, which is, polarizing in a way, but like, yeah, conflict can be very, very clarifying. You get to know real fast, who is on your side versus who is not, right? Do you then have to protect yourself, right? What are your goals? What are your desires, right? Like even rage in that way, like the things that we're angry about is so clarifying because it reveals what you love, right? And so yeah, I love all of that. The same thing with like form, if I'm interested in the sonnet. Like, I want to know why has the sonnet been this way for so long? In what ways can I break it a little bit? Right? That's what makes this fun, I feel like. Otherwise, yeah, I would not be interested.
Um, I love what you're saying about sort of like rage too. I feel like my poems are angry. I'm like violently sensitive in my poems, right? And it like moves between like a deep sensitivity, um, but also like coupled with a lot of anger and sadness, kind of like, those two things are pretty related. Um, but I think on the language level, for me, like those languages can exist within the same stanza, right? So there can be something that's extremely violent, but also like quite touching happening all at once. And I feel like poetry and language and the way it kind of like slows time and makes us like consider each word, consider each phrase, allows those things to sort of like be accepted and exist at once in a way that is hard to do when you're out there in the world. So the way it slows it down and it's like accepting, and you can bring in those things and manipulate them. Um, you know, the negative things that are received, you can take them and you can manipulate them. You can make it sensitive. You can like bring light to it. You can see it. Um, I think that that's pretty important. Um, yeah, it's also, I think it's significant. People there's a lot less readership for poetry and there's a lot of mystery around it. So I also see it as like I'm still armored up in some way. Like language is, I'm once revealing, but I'm also sort of like protected in this realm.
Yeah, I think kind of looking at like what we receive, what we inherit, it's something that I was maybe less conscious about. I agree that like I was wrestling with a lot of these things probably for many, many years. And my first book, is it's about fatherhood among other things, but it's also about like making objects and like the language of tools and boat building, which I was finding all these metaphors for the human experience in that. But I also think that I was playing with like notions of the masculinity that I was, receiving growing up. Like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a father? And there was a certain kind of like play there, a certain kind of like I'm kind of investigating these things, but again, not with great consciousness in necessarily that same way. Uh, my second book is very much directly looking at that. And because it's about addiction and about getting sober, one of the things that I was really interested in and continue to be interested in is really being honest about the impacts on family, on people close to those addicted, as well as on the self. And I though I've had great people in my life, I feel like I still struggle to see good models of people being truly honest and then accountable. I think that there's so many examples, particularly of men being called on doing something harmful and then either like disappearing or doing some sort of apology and seeking forgiveness, but then nothing really changes, and that's like the model out there. Oh, they have these redeeming qualities or whatever. It's redemption. And for me, that's not helpful and hasn't been helpful. And so while it's incredibly painful and leaves things open, I just had this sense that the thing that I needed and that I sense maybe the world needs um, is a different kind of thing that doesn't resolve easily. It's not redemption, it's transformation. It's the kind of accountability that keeps the wound open because it doesn't just go away with an apology or someone saying, I forgive you. It's not simple that way. Um, I'm a father of sons too, and so I think about all of these things. Um, but over time it has evolved to be much more present in like my work in terms of really really trying to reckon with these things. So I'm deeply invested in it, and it's something that remains kind of mysterious to me. Like every time I get into conversation around it, I still am not certain I know what I'm saying or what I believe or understand. um, so yeah, it's ongoing.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing part of that answer for you is um, what I've received. No, that's not quite it, right? No, that kind of that model that you received was not quite it. It contains something else. There's something more to it. Uh, I'm curious if Ayokunle or Andres, you have responses to each other in what Matt just shared or what each of you have shared.
I'll go. That's all right. Yeah, I think that that idea of kind of you're talking about like the tools and building and like sort of like these received forms of masculinity, and then we're echoing out that idea of like, no, it's not quite that. Um, it's pretty compelling to like try to begin to build something new, right? Like you've received it, you have these tools, the tools don't work, and yet you're influenced by and like you're trying to like cobble together, for lack of a better word, like a new way of being, right? Of like evolving in certain ways, and then trying to pass that down as a whole nother layer of you're trying to build something and it's flawed as well, right? And like you're grappling with like the day to day, and you figuring out and trying to teach someone else how to like figure these things out is like super difficult. um and I do think it's very like, as an artist, I'm beginning to notice the different ways in which I'm like thinking through my poems, right? Like my poems 15 years ago are quite different from now, even though they might be tapping into the same subject. So that's fascinating. And it's fascinating for me to like read others doing that. That's why like I love to read multiple books by people, right? Or just like see the arc of what this person is trying to build and tap into, even if they're like sort of like mining those same core questions.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And yeah, for me, like being a father, and also like I have a daughter, right? So not quite uh the same um no, not responsibility is not the correct word. Maybe challenges, right? Of raising boys, right? And for me, I did not want a son, right? I really wanted a daughter. Um, and I'm so glad, right? I would have been glad if I had a son too, but I really did not want a son. And part of the reason was because of my relationship with my own father, right? There were aspects of masculinity that I wanted to, reject, right? And I think for me, it would have been a lot harder to be able to be faced with the task of raising a son while being aware of like the burden of masculinity in a way, right? Like rejecting it for myself, but also rejecting it for my son. Just felt like so much of a burden that I did not want that, right? And that's not to say that there are not aspects of masculinity that are beautiful. There are, right? And the challenge is to wake up every day, right, with that knowledge, right, and not to go one extreme of, uh, abandon masculinity. I don't think that is the right approach either, at least not for myself. I think it's leaning more in the direction of what Matt said earlier about transformation, right? You have received this, you can't give it back, right? Not entirely. How can you transform it, right, for yourself and for the people around you, so that it becomes something, tender, right? It becomes something that is that is embracing in a way, right? That can be an indication of love. Because I think, there are aspects of masculinity that are loving, that are tender. Um, I think, for instance, about like the gesture of affection that is not named that, in the way that like your barber, right, holds you, right, tenderly and has a blade against your neck, right? That is so tender, right? Uh, but it also contains like an aspect of like violence that is like not acknowledged, right? Because he can cut you, right? But he doesn't, right? And you come back every now and then and offer your neck to him, right? To be able to like make you beautiful in a way. So there are aspects of that that are very, very tender and like heartwarming. But yeah, as a person who's like raising a daughter who is also into language, as I read in the Intro to Semantics poem, like every day I'm faced with the like responsibility of being transformed, right? When she says something and immediately I want to go, this is what I've been given, this is what I've inherited about the English language, and these are the rules, these are the norms, these are the forms. And she doesn't care about that. She says, jump me in the air instead of throw me in the air. And I don't go, no, 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 baby, it's throw me in the air, right? Like I don't do that. I take that as an invitation to like enter something new. Like, okay, I did not know that we could do that, right? Hooray, right? That's beautiful for me as an artist, but also as a person because it allows me to like negotiate who do I want to be today, right? When she does something that's like very, very frustrating, you know, okay, do I want to take a moment, right, to calm myself down, right, and approach that from a very different way than my dad would have, for instance, right? That's something that I have to do every single every single day, right? And it can be taxing, but it can also be very generative and also very rewarding in a way because now I'm like, a different version of myself, right? In a way, and I get to show up in the world in a way that feels very very good, right? As a man, as a black man, right? As an African man, yeah, and ultimately, the more you do that, the more it gets more comfortable, and it becomes a model for the people around you, right? For like other options of, I think Andrea said earlier, like ways of being, right? Like it's another way of being in the world that can be healing for the people around you, which is, ultimately about, at the end of the day, like Matt said, about transformation. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. You know, as you each of you were talking, kind of going through my mind was that each of you are offering through your work and through this conversation a masculinity that is not exclusionary, a masculinity that's inclusive, masculinity that embraces like elements of tenderness, of affection, of love. As you were also talking, I am often struck by moments of tenderness, masculine tenderness in sports, for example. I watch a lot of sports to unwind after school. So, and I noticed that it's that on a sporting field, there's something that happens where it's a touch between masculine folks seems to be what's the word I'm looking for? Just absolutely accepted. Whereas I don't see it as much in day-to-day life. I didn't see it in day-to-day life in Australia, and I don't see it so much in day-to-day life in the US. And so I really appreciate each of you offering this kind of pushing on this question of, okay, what does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be masculine? Here are my questions, and here's a possible answer to this question. So I think that's really beautiful. Any of you have reflections on that comment?
Yeah, I think it's good to speak towards that inclusivity. And for me, I think there's a part of it is, if we're talking about reception or inheritance of, expectations or, understanding of certain identities, um, they're often revealing kind of a sliver. Like the popular way we receive things is just like one sliver of that. And it's only if we're really lucky that we're in like a community or a family that we get, something that is more coherent, that is more inclusive and, reveals all the possibilities there. So, as I grow, what I see is there's a lot more to masculinity than most people get to see, right? And it does include tenderness, and it does include strength, and it does include the ability to do things, but it doesn't have to include hurting people, right? So there's like all these ways that we've done things that are really kind of we just see the sliver of it, and we talk about it in that way. Um, and yeah, it's not just one thing, right? Culturally, personally, like there's a spectrum. But I like it, think about it as like a kind of a compass wheel. It holds all the pieces. And so it's really easy to be just dominant in one direction. And that's not really working for most people.
I want to jump in and ask a question, partly selfishly, but also I know that there'll be folks. At least I'm certain that the folks in the program will also in the MFA program at Eastern will be watching and listening, and other folks who also express life through writing. And I'm curious to know from each of you what has been helpful to you that you've received over the years in terms of feeding your creative self, feeding your artistic self, and perhaps what you wish you'd known earlier.
Um, I think that there was a period of time where I believed that in order to be creative, like I needed to like be outside of my own life in a lot of ways, right? Like that I needed to do that in like there was regular life and then there was my creative life and they were in like two different buckets. And as I've grown, I think that it's been really, really important for me to figure out how to integrate them, right? And not view them as separate. Everything that's dead and in the past and everything that I'm sad about and angry about that's already gone, that's where my creative soul lives. Like that's not how I want to just like go back to this thing that I will continually go back to day after day. I want to be able to sort of like integrate it with my life. And that doesn't mean that I can't have like moments where, yeah, I get a little grant and I can like go away for a little bit, maybe for a week or something like that. That's amazing, right? It allows for concentration. but integrating it into my life is really, really important. And I think something that MFA is specific, I would say, and like in terms of like toxic masculinity, I think that in my own MFA program, I was hyper competitive, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Um, leaving workshop being like, all right, this person had the best poem, this person had the worst poem. I'm somewhere in the middle. I want to come back next week and like win is not really productive. It's not a soccer match or, a boxing match. But still, putting in the work and like wanting to sort of like honor a great tradition that we're in is important, right? Wanting to be better is important. Yeah. So those are the things.
I guess the thing I think is important to hear, especially if you're in an MFA, is that there's no one way about it. And people are really good about talking about what works for them and sometimes making that seem like that's the way. And I know I received that from people I really admired, and it was really confusing when my life looked very different. And I was like, well, I guess I got to change everything I'm doing or how I'm approaching this. Um, and with that said, I'm speaking from my life only. And one of the things that I have found is that sometimes my deepest experiences and access to writing work that matters to me has been through living in communities and parts of the world and life that are far outside of, the writing world. And so I know that, some people absolutely love and thrive in teaching and talking about writing all the time. And I've taught writing and love that too. But I've also done a lot of other things. And like right after my MFA, like literally I graduated and a month later I moved and went to boat building school. And I learned almost as much, if not more, about writing by building boats as I did in my MFA, right? So that's just one possibility. And then I did all these other things that had nothing to do necessarily with writing on the surface. But just by showing up with that awareness and that kind of interest and love, I became a better writer, And so that's the only thing I would say is that you can really grow as a writer by being invested in a lot of things that don't on the surface look like they might feed it.
And if I can add anything to those two brilliant responses, is to just remember to have fun, honestly. Um, writing is not that serious. It is serious, but it is not that serious. It is in some way just a part of your life, to echo what they said. It is not your life, right? And I think there is a temptation to make it seem like it is our whole identity, right? It's like, but still remember that you're a son, right? You're a daughter, you're a child, you're a friend, right? You're a partner, if you're into that kind of thing. I'm kidding. But you have your whole life outside of writing that you still need to attend to. And writing is just a small, small part of it. Um, and while you're at it, remember to have fun. Remember what drove you to it in the first place, right? It is, the mystique of language, right? Is the music of it, right? That's the thing that possibly drew you to it in the first place. And as much as you can, just remember that. I have been very lucky over the course of my writing life to be reminded of that. It's just at the end of the day, it's just play. And it is a miracle that we get to make things out of language, right? And other people are able to kind of tune into it in a way, even though we're like vastly different, we're living vastly different lives. There is something in what somebody has written that still resonates with my own life. And I think that's magical. And I think we need to remember that as much as we can.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of magical, this has been a magical hour to spend with you all. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Get Lit for hosting and putting on this event. And I'm sure we could spend another hour, but I want to respect each of your times. But highly recommend folks that are watching. Highly recommend each of these books. strongly, strongly recommend. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Kate and Mackenzie as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jed. That was fantastic. And thank you, Ayakunle, Andres, and Matt. It was just so wonderful to hear all of your work. Thank you for sharing so much of yourselves and your stories with us in that conversation as well. That was so powerful. I loved especially what you said, Ayakunle, about poetry being a space that allows you the fullest expression of yourself, which in itself is an act of love. So I love that Jed asked that question and that we were able to just learn so much more about all of you and how you think about poetry. Again, we're grateful for your work and the time you spent with us today, and we can't wait to share with our festival audience so that they can get to know you as well. Thank you again, Jed, for asking such great questions and for spending so much time with the work as well. And thanks also to Mackenzie, Get Lit's assistant coordinator, for all of their hard work today and behind the scenes leading up to this event. To everyone watching at home, I hope that you will join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for our full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's talented poets. Thank you again for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.